Hello everybody and welcome to this oral session about moral disengagement. My name is Kalle Gustafsson and I'm Head of Education at Stiftelsen Friends, and I have the great honor to be the host for these 55 minutes and 3 speakers here today. Each speaker will hold a presentation about 50 minutes and we will end up with 10 minutes Q&A. And all you who are here online, please use the Q&A function and not the chat for sending in your question. And everybody in the room, we will have a QR code. You know this by now. You scan that and you fill in your questions, and I will moderating the Q&A the last minutes of this oral session. So now when you know all this, let me welcome and introduce the first speaker, Marlene Bjärehed, who will talk about individual and classroom collective moral disengagement in offline and online bullying. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today presenting this paper with a quite long title, Individual and Classroom Collective Moral Disengagement in Offline and Online Bullying, a short-term multi-level growth model study. And first I want to mention that this study is part of a larger longitudinal project that has been conducted at Linköping University. And this project has been led by Professor Robert Thornberg. And within this project we follow students from grade 4, and that is the age of 10 in the Swedish school system, till the grade of 8, so when they are 13. And within this project, students answered a web-based questionnaire once each academic year. And I want to give you some background also on the Swedish school system. Some of you may be familiar, but it may be not for all. So in Sweden, compulsory schooling is divided into 4 stages. First, there is a preschool year, and at the age of 6, and then lower elementary school, which is lågstadiet, and that is grade 1 to grade 3, so the ages of 7 to 9, and this is followed by upper elementary school, mellanstadiet, and this is grades 4 to grade 6, and then the final stage of compulsory school, and that is lower secondary school, so 13 to 15. And this study that I present today focused on the last 2 years of upper elementary school. So that is grade 5 and grade 6. So the students were 11 and then 1 year later, 12 years old. And also in Swedish upper elementary schools, students most commonly remain with the same classmates for the full day, more or less. And they have 1 or 2 class teachers that follow them through grades 4 to grade 6. And I also want to mention that when I use the term classroom, like in the title for this presentation, this refers to the formal group of students as a unit, so the school class. So not only the physical classroom space, but the group as a unit. And in school, the classroom is the most proximal influence, and previous studies show that bullying and victimization prevalence vary greatly between classrooms, which suggests that the classroom's context is indeed a significant social unit to study. And for this study, I have used Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory for the overarching framework. And from a social cognitive perspective, bullying can be understood as a complex phenomenon in which both individual and social environmental factors interact. So the social cognitive theory thus focuses on the individual child while taking care not to overlook the social and dynamic processes involved in bullying. And of course, there are many factors that could influence bullying, both individual and social environmental factors. But in this study, I have focused particularly on moral disengagement, and this is the overall session focus as well. So, according to the social cognitive theory, engaging in harmful behavior, such as bullying, will usually result in moral self-sanctions, such as feelings of guilt and shame. However, moral disengagement mechanisms sidesteps these moral standards, allowing individuals to act against inner moral standards without activating negative feelings. So basically, it provides an explanation of how individuals can engage in immoral behavior and still be able to live with themselves. So moral disengagement includes various mechanisms, such as cognitively restructuring harmful behavior as something more socially acceptable, diminishing its severity, or putting blame on the victim. And individual moral disengagement and its link to aggressive behavior and bullying has been extensively studied during the last decades. And previous studies have consistently shown that greater moral disengagement is associated with more bullying perpetration, both offline, in person, or traditional bullying, but also online bullying. And most of these studies are still cross-sectional, but there is also a growing number of studies that are longitudinal with some mixed findings. But for example, moral disengagement has been found to predict offline bullying among adolescents, and there has been found a bidirectional association with offline bullying in elementary school children. However, less is known about how changes in individual students' tendency to morally disengage are linked to changes in bullying. So this is one of the things that I wanted to examine in this particular study. And as I mentioned previously, previous research suggests that the classroom context can influence and interact with individuals' behaviors and cognitions. And in addition to individual moral disengagement, this study also included moral disengagement at the classroom level in the form of classroom collective moral disengagement. And in short, collective moral disengagement refers to moral disengagement beliefs that are shared within a significant social group, such as the peer group or the classroom. And Bandura also highlighted that collective moral disengagement should not be considered merely as the aggregation of moral disengagement of its individual members, but as a group-level phenomenon produced by the group dynamics. So classroom collective moral disengagement can therefore be interpreted as a group characteristic at the classroom level with the potential to influence the prevalence of bullying. And in the present study, classroom collective moral disengagement was operationalized by aggregating individual students' perceptions of how widespread and shared moral disengagement is among classmates. So I will show you the scale in a while too. And there are a few studies that have started to elaborate on this issue. And as you can see, my name is on the reference list there, together with Robert Thunberg as well. But the findings from this study suggest that students in classrooms characterized by higher levels of classroom collective moral disengagement tend to engage in offline bullying more than students in classrooms with lower levels of classroom collective moral disengagement. However, we know less about whether classroom collective moral disengagement also influenced bullying online. So this was something that I wanted to examine in this study. And also whether changes in classroom collective moral disengagement is associated with changes in bullying. So, the aim of this particular study was to examine whether individual and classroom collective moral disengagement were associated with offline and online bullying. And also whether changes in individual and classroom collective moral disengagement from the grade 5 to grade 6 were associated with changes in online and offline bullying. And included in this analysis were self-report data from 1,048 students within 68 different classrooms. And we collected this data in the southern and middle parts of Sweden. So the students were in 5th grade at the first time point and approximately 1 year later than in grade 6. So this was the questionnaire. Within the project, offline bullying were measured through an 11-item scale, and we asked students to think about the past 3 months. How often have you done the following things towards one or more students who are weaker, less popular, or less in charge in comparison to you? So the word bullying is not mentioned, but we aim to build in the power imbalance in this description. And this was followed by 11 behavioral items. So 5 physical items, 3 verbal, and 3 relational. And the online bullying scale asks students to think about the past 3 months. How often have you done the following things towards one or more students who are weaker, less popular, or less in charge in comparison to you by using a mobile phone, computer, or tablet? And consider situations both in school and outside school. And this scale then followed by 6 behavioral items. For example, send hurtful and mean messages to the person through Facebook, Snapchat, or Kik. And for each of the items, students responded on a 5-point scale from I have never done that to several times a week. And then we have the 2 moral disengagement scales. So individual moral disengagement was measured using an 18-item scale that asks students to which degree they agreed or disagreed with the statements that followed. For example, if you can't be like everybody else, it's your own fault that you get bullied or frozen out. And then the students answered on a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then we have the classroom collective moral disengagement scale. And here we ask students, in your class, how many students think that? And then the same statements followed. So if you can't be like everybody else, it's your own fault if you get bullied or frozen out. So the students answered, how many in your class thinks this? And then they could choose between none up to everyone. So to analyze this, I used multi-level growth modeling with 3 levels. So we have the measurement occasions, nested within students, nested within classrooms. So by doing this, I could see the average bullying score in 5th grade, average change in bullying from 5th grade to 6th grade, and also examine the effects of changes in individual moral disengagement and classroom collective moral disengagement, controlling for the effects of the grade 5 scores as well. So what did the results show? Well, first, the results show that students who in the 5th grade score higher on individual moral disengagement were more inclined to bully others. So they had higher bullying trajectories, both offline and online. Offline and online bullying. And second, I found that students in classrooms with higher classroom collective moral disengagement were more prone to bully others offline and online. And this was over and above their individual tendency to morally disengage in the 5th grade. And regarding changes in individual moral disengagement and collective moral disengagement, I found that changes in individual moral disengagement, but not changes in classroom collective moral disengagement, were associated with changes in offline and online bullying. So, while previous longitudinal studies suggest that individual moral disengagement may predict greater aggression and bullying over time, the findings in this study show that students who increased more in comparison to the average change among students also increased over time in offline and online bullying. So I have a few minutes left to lift the discussion and implications. Although change in classroom collective moral disengagement was not associated with change in bullying offline and online in the present study, classrooms differed in their level of classroom collective moral disengagement in the 5th grade, and this difference partially explained the difference in the offline and online bullying trajectories of individuals. So this finding may imply that collective moral disengagement is something that could be addressed early in the formation of a class or a group to inhibit the development of these processes early on. And the results also support the importance of addressing school bullying as a complex social phenomenon and not merely as a private concern between a bully and a victim. And it also supports that preventive work against bullying and intervention programs need to consider the classroom and classroom context as well. And I think it would be beneficial for teachers and other school personnel to be aware of the processes of moral disengagement and the role it plays in bullying. It could be beneficial to include features that aim to challenge students' individual tendencies to use moral disengagement mechanisms, as well as perceptions and collective processes at the classroom level as well. So I think I will leave it there, because we will also listen to some how this can be implemented in the classroom as well later on. So I will. This has also been published if you want to read more about in psychology in the schools just a week ago. Thank you.
The next speaker on stage here is Sevgi Bayram Özdemir, and she will talk about reinforcers and passive bystanders of ethnic victimization, the role of moral disengagement and class climate. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm very happy to be here and to present some of my recent findings related to reinforcers and passive bystanders of ethnic victimization. And in this study, we were particularly interested in the role of moral disengagement and class climate. We are living in a time that we have seen demonstration against racism and xenophobia, and people have been marching for solidarity and unity. That's one side of the picture. On the other side, we also see anti-immigrant demonstrations all over the world. And what is happening in the big society has implication when it comes to how young people interact with each other in a school setting. For example, a recent report by the Public Health Agency has shown that 1 in 5 school-age children with immigrant background in Sweden, they have reported that they are treated negatively because of their ethnic or because of their cultural background. And these obviously have implications when it comes to the psychological functioning and school adjustment of these young people. And at the same time, these negative experiences open the door for engagement in problem behaviors, including engagement in violent or delinquent behaviors and affiliation with deviant peers. So who are the perpetrators of ethnic victimization? Growing but limited body of research has shown that young people who have negative attitudes towards immigrants, or those who have high levels of moral disengagement, of lack of empathic concerns, are the ones who victimize their peers with minority background. So perpetrators and victims are the two main actors in a case of ethnic victimization. But a large group of young people are neither the perpetrators nor the victims, but they are rather bystanders. And some of these bystanders may act to support the victim, whereas others may prefer to stay passive, or they may provide support to the perpetrator. And the reactions of bystander may be the key thing to understand the prevalence and changes of ethnic victimization in a particular setting. So what do we know about the bystanders of ethnic victimization? If we take a look at the literature, we have seen that there are different theoretical perspectives that try to explain why or how young people respond to ethnic victimization incidents at a school setting. So the first theoretical perspective put an emphasis on intergroup contact. And the main standpoint of this theoretical perspective is that when young people have greater interethnic contact in a school setting, they have more opportunities to engage in diverse perspective. And because of that reason, they have the ability to develop a better understanding of the experiences or the perspective of their peers with diverse background. And the studies using this theoretical perspective have shown that young people who have greater contact with immigrants in their school setting, they are more likely to talk to the victim or say something to the perpetrator when they observe a bias-based bullying. So the second theoretical perspectives highlight the importance of the role of social group affiliation. So what does that mean? How do you identify yourself? And in addition to that, intergroup processes such as in-group or out-group biases. And so the studies using this theoretical perspective have shown that young people with immigrant backgrounds or those who are open to diverse views or who have low in-group biases, they are the ones who take stronger assertive action to intervene in a case of bias-based name-calling or social exclusion. And the last theoretical perspective put the emphasis on social and cognitive processes. And the main standpoint of this perspective is that young people differ from one another when it comes to how they interpret the social cues and how they interpret the intentions of the perpetrators, and then how also they understand the emotions of victims. And these factors may play a role how they act when they observe and bias-based bullying in their school context. So in conclusion, all these theoretical perspective and associated empirical findings provide us valuable information in terms of the role of intergroup and social cognitive processes in relation to this topic. But the main limitation of the literature is that we really do not have a good understanding when it comes to the possible role of contextual factor. And in addition to that, we have also limited knowledge in relation to how individual and contextual factors interact when explaining the bystander behaviors in a school setting. I mean, we all know that peer victimization occurs in a social setting, and the norm and the climate of that setting may impact young people's approval or disapproval of the behavior and affect their behaviors and action. In addition to that, the effect of contextual factors on young people's bystander behavior may vary depending on who the individual is, so depending on the young people's individual characteristics. So to keep all this a gap in the literature, in the present study, what we did is we tried to integrate two different theoretical perspectives, and then we examined three main research questions. So our first research question was to understand whether disengagement from morality is related to young people's bystander behavior. And our second question was to understand whether class context, class climate matter when it comes to how young people act when they witness an ethnicity-based victimization. So regarding the class context here, we were particularly interested in understanding the role of positive inter-ethnic contact norms in class, meaning that how inclusive the classroom environment is, and to what extent young people perceive that everybody is respecting to one another related to their cultural values and so on. So that was one dimension of class context. And in addition to that, we also look at the role of teachers. How do they respond to ethnic victimization? And here, our main focus was on teachers' non-tolerance of ethnic victimization. And then the last research question was to examine whether class context reduce or elevate morally disengaged young people's reinforcing and passive bystander behaviors. So the sample for the current study comes from a 3-year longitudinal study which is called Youth and Diversity Project. And we focus on 7th grade students, and they are coming from 55 different classrooms in Sweden. And majority of the young people in our sample had Swedish-born parents. So when it comes to the measure, we use a 10-item scale to measure moral disengagement. I'm not going to go through all the items. And then for the positive interethnic contact norms, we use a 5-item scale. So you can see the example item in my slides. And with regard to teachers' non-tolerance of ethnic victimization, we use a 2-item scale. As for young people's response to ethnic victimization, very similar to previous work, we provide them a STEM question, and then we ask them how likely they will act. So we have a statement related to reinforcing the perpetrator, and then we also have a statement that measure passive bystander behavior. So what did we find? With regard to reinforcers of ethnic victimization, when we look at the individual factors, we see that females and young people with high openness to diversity were less likely to reinforce the perpetrator. On the other hand, morally disengaged young people were more likely to watch the situation and laugh. And in addition to that, at the individual level, we also find a significant interaction between moral disengagement and interethnic contact norms. So what does that mean? That means that when morally disengaged young people, when they perceive that their classmates in the classroom are open to diverse views and they respect to one another, they were less likely to reinforce the bullies. And then when it comes to the class level factor, what we have seen is that when the teachers make it clear to the students that no one can make negative comments about others because of their ethnic background, in such a classroom environment, young people had less intention to watch the situation and laugh. So when it comes to the passive bystanders of ethnic victimization, at the individual level, we see a similar pattern. Once again, females and young people with high openness to diversity, they were less likely to act as nothing happened, but on the other hand, morally disengaged young people were more likely to be the passive bystanders of ethnic victimization. And then when we look at the classroom level factors, except the proportion of girls in a classroom environment, none of the classroom level factors play a role in passive bystander behaviors. So what are the take-home message? The first take-home message is that both individual and contextual factor seems to contribute to the reinforcement of ethnic victimization, whereas individual factors seems to play a role in adolescents' passive bystander behaviors. Morally disengaged adolescents are at risk for being reinforcer, but at the same time passive bystanders of ethnic victimization. Probably when young people deviate from morality, they are more likely to attribute the responsibility to the victim, and they underestimate the consequences of ethnicity-based bullying. And because of that reason, they are in the situation that they ignore the problem, or they may engage in behaviors that directly or indirectly support the bullies. And then the next take-home message is that, and this is, I think, very important, morally disengaged young people's perception of class climate matter in how they respond to ethnic victimization incidents. So as I said earlier, when morally disengaged young people perceive their classmates as being open to diverse view, being respectful to each other's cultural values and norms, they were less likely to reinforce the bullies. So that means that it's very critical to create a class setting where diverse views and values are appreciated and respected. And then the next take-home message is that teachers' clear message of no tolerance of ethnic victimization have the potential to prevent young people's intention to reinforce the bullies. So probably when teachers have a clear message of no tolerance to ethnic victimization, young people may question the acceptability of that behavior, and then they may be less likely to mentally justify it. To summarize, what are the implications that we can propose based on the finding? First, there's a need to identify ways to intervene in the maladaptive cognitive processes of young people that decouple them from morality. So that's very critical. And then the next thing that we can suggest based on the finding is that there's a need to focus on diversity and inclusion in teacher training, and then also promote cultural competence and conflict resolution skills among teachers. This is the end of my presentation, and before I end, I would like to thank to all the teachers and schools and the students for their support. Thank you so much.
The next speaker is ClimateSevgi Tolmatcheff, and she's going to talk about the effectiveness and mediating roles of moral disengagement and class norms as anti-bullying components, a randomized controlled trial. Welcome, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is ClimateSevgi Tolmatcheff, and I've recently finished my PhD thesis. I know this session is mainly about moral disengagement, but I'll also talk about social norms, as these are the two anti-bullying components that I tested in my research. So as you all know, because of the prevalence and consequences of bullying, there's been an increasing number of programs developed. While some of these programs have shown positive effects, meta-analysis suggests overall limited and mixed results. I argue that this is in part because of the black box of anti-bullying programs, which mainly results from two gaps in the evaluations. These gaps limit our understanding of how these programs work and our knowledge of their effective components. So first, most evaluation studies do not measure the hypothesized mediators targeted by the interventions to ultimately impact bullying, and they generally assess the behavioral outcomes only. Second, anti-bullying programs are usually assessed as a whole package, although they usually contain several components targeting different factors associated with bullying. And so, as a result, we don't know the unique contribution of each component and therefore what the effective ingredients are. So in my PhD thesis aims to make a first step in opening the black box of programs by addressing these two methodological gaps. But apart from these gaps, the limited effectiveness of programs also invites researchers to continue studying new directions for preventing bullying by testing relevant components based on theory and prior research. While most students consider bullying immoral and disapprove of it, many actually bully others or do nothing to support the victims. Both the moral disengagement and social norm frameworks provide a rationale to explain this discrepancy and have been suggested as promising directions for prevention. So the second goal of my PhD thesis was just to test these two innovative and promising anti-bullying components. So really, in a nutshell, because Marlene already presented it very well, saving me time, according to Bandura's theory of moral disengagement, transgressing or moral principles leads to self-sanctions such as guilt. However, one can escape these self-sanctions through some cognitive processes, the so-called moral disengagement mechanisms. So the rationale is if students can no longer rely on these mechanisms, they shouldn't be able to deactivate their internal controls, whether as bullies or as bystanders. So they would undergo the unpleasant self-sanctions, which should in turn discourage their immoral behavior. The intervention I used was inspired by the bullying literature project Moral Disengagement version developed by Wang and Goldberg. In a few words, I created children's stories displaying various bullying situations to illustrate the use of moral disengagement mechanisms by the bullies. The mechanisms were identified by the students and then invalidated as unacceptable excuses for immoral behavior. Social norms refer to what is typical or desirable in a group and shape, constrain, and maintain behaviors of group members over and above individual attitudes. However, what people perceive to be the norm is not necessarily accurate. Students tend to overestimate, sometimes drastically, the prevalence of bullying behaviors and pro-bullying attitudes among their peers. As a result, they tend to conform to this biased norm, which in turn maintain and reinforce the collective misperception over time. So the rationale is, if we correct students' misperceptions of their classmates' attitudes toward bullying, that is the perceived injunctive class norm, it should discourage bullies' behaviors and increase bystanders' willingness to intervene, as they would no longer mistakenly feel support toward bullying. The intervention I used was based on the Survey of Bullying at Your School project developed by Perkins and colleagues. And in a nutshell, we used students' anonymous self-reports of their perception of their classmates' attitudes and their personal attitudes toward bullying to highlight the discrepancy between the two at the class level. And then students were invited to create artistic posters displaying norm-based messages claiming the actual injunctive class norm. So I conducted a three-armed randomized controlled trial with a moral disengagement condition, a social norm condition, and an active control group in a sample of more than 1,200 elementary school students from grades 4 to 6. Regarding the mediators, I used the French version of the moral disengagement in bullying scale adapted from Robert Thunberg and Jungert scale. And for the perceived injunctive class norm, I presented students with statements measuring attitudes toward bullying and asked them what most of their classmates would answer instead of their own opinion. The bullying scale included direct, indirect, and cyber forms of bullying, and the two bystander scales were based on the shortened version of the participant role scale. So here is the full statistical model. I used structural equation modeling with latent change models, controlling for the nested structure at the class level to address the two methodological gaps and determine the effectiveness of intervening exclusively on moral disengagement and exclusively on class norms as anti-bullying components. And here are the results. So intervening on moral disengagement significantly decreased moral disengagement in students. And this decrease, in turn, was associated with a decrease in bullying and outsider behaviors and to an increase in defender behaviors. And the three corresponding indirect effects were all significant. And I want to draw your attention on the significant direct effect of the intervention increasing bullying behaviors, because it was enough to cancel the indirect effect, leading to a non-significant total effect of the intervention. And Sensitivity analysis revealed that this direct effect of the intervention concerned indirect bullying behaviors only. Keep that in mind. Intervening on class norms significantly decreased bullying behaviors. However, this change did not flow through the expected mediator, that is the perceived injunctive class norm. So, addressing these two methodological gaps enabled us to not only test the hypotheses behind the interventions, but also to interpret the results accurately. Had I not measured the mediating path, I could have wrongly concluded that reducing moral disengagement was not a means to reduce bullying because of the concurrent direct effect in the opposite direction. On the other hand, I could also have wrongly concluded that correcting students' misperception of the injunctive class norm was effective to reduce bullying, although the intervention effect did not flow through this very mediator. Regarding the effectiveness of the component, the findings support the role of moral disengagement in bullying and its potential for prevention. Now, remember the direct effect of the intervention, so not related to moral disengagement, that increased indirect bullying behaviors only. I think we can imagine that some students were less receptive to the intervention, most likely some bullies. These students may have strategically adjusted their behavior by turning to more hidden forms of bullying in reaction to the general change in moral disengagement among their classmates. And I think that this touches the notion of collective moral disengagement presented by Marlene. The intervention on class norms did decrease bullying, but not through the expected mediator. So it must have flowed through another mediator. And this is quite interesting because it also shows that we still don't know the underlying mechanism of social norms that well. So perhaps the intervention weakened the subjective perception of social pressure without actually leading students to cognitively reconstruct their estimate of the norm. Or maybe another type of norm mediated the intervention. For instance, friends may be seen as a more relevant reference group than the whole class as norm setters. Teachers, as we all know, also convey norms toward bullying. And it has also been suggested that popular students are particularly influential in setting the class norm. So perhaps bullies, who often have high status in the class, were more sensitive to the intervention as they're particularly fearful of losing their dominant position. So it would be their perception of the class norm that mediated the effect of the intervention. And this hypothesis is also consistent with the fact that there was no effect on bystander behaviors. Perhaps the intervention primarily had an impact on bullies, but standing up to the bullies represented too high a risk for bystanders. And in that case, a remaining question would be, of course, whether this relatively short-term effect on bullies could translate into a change in bystanders' perception of the class norms and consequently behaviors in the long term. So we certainly need more research that examines the underlying processes of social norms to clarify prevention avenues. We should also look further into the differential effects of the two interventions on different subgroups of students. In my PhD thesis, I clearly advocate for a return to the roots of anti-bullying programs by isolating relevant components and testing their unique effects within separate interventions. However, these single components shouldn't be seen as programs. We probably need to combine relevant components that have proven effective in isolation to maximize the effectiveness of anti-bullying interventions. However, maybe some components would no longer make a significant contribution to the overall effect once they're combined with others. So the inclusion of each additional component should be carefully weighted in terms of cost-effectiveness ratio from a public health perspective. And that would be the next step for continuing to open the black box of anti-bullying programs. So as a take-home message, I would simply say that no step should be skipped in the fight against bullying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome back to stage, all of the speakers, and you may take a share. And you still have the time to send in some questions. Use your QR code, and if you are with us online, use the Q&A function and not the chat. Welcome back. And I can just say like this, that all of these three presentations have been crystal clear because I have no questions here in my in the platform. So very good to you, but I have a question for you. And that is that we are all here to terminate bullying, and we have this conference just to, you know, speed up the time from researchers' new knowledge to help all the teachers and adults who work with kids worldwide. So a question for me is, maybe we have some teachers or school staff in here or with us online. What can you say from your research directly to them, something that they can do on Monday morning when they meet the kids again?
Sure, I can start. I think that I will just rely on the empirical findings based on my research in specific technique victimization. I think that they need to make it clear to the kids that ethnic victimization is not going to be tolerated in the school environment. So they can do that in many different ways, but the message needs to be very clear to the kids so that they can prevent it. So that will be my message.
Thank you. Marlene, the same question to you. What will you say?
Well, I think it's important to try to work with the preventive work, with the values, value work, värdegrundsarbetet, and include also aspects of moral disengagement and discuss with all students, because it's not only those who are high moral disengagement that engage in bullying, but also a risk factor for all to use these mechanisms. So I think to try to implement in the daily work, talk to the kids, ask them also, of course, what they think.
Thank you. Same question for you.
Yeah, I fully agree, of course, with Marlene and Sevgi. And I would say, based on the results of my research, that outside of the context of a very specific intervention, so on the prevention side, a sound knowledge of moral disengagement mechanisms by adults in the school could be already very helpful to identify them when they face a bullying situation, and to invalidate them as soon as they're used by students. So just knowing these mechanisms for teachers could be already very useful to detect them and invalidate them.
Thank you. Let's see, Marlene and presenters, Is there any easy surveys to measure moral disengagement? Is there a link between the number of student exhibition, individual moral disengagement, and class level? I think it's for all of you, but Marlene, what do you think? Is there any easy surveys to measure moral disengagement?
Well, the surveys that we have used can be used, I think, and I know that they have been used as well in Swedish.
Great. I think we say thank you for the presentation, and thank you for you all who are here and all of you that listen to us online. Give them a hand, I think.